Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me again. I'd like to read you a story called Touring Paris with Jim Morrison. I wrote it for Chicken Soup for the Soul's book, Angels and Miracles, back in 2016. I hope you enjoy it. When I was 27 years old, I traveled to Paris alone. Shortly after my arrival, I met a local woman named Laurence, who offered to show me around the city. I asked her to take me to Père Lachaise Cemetery. She thought it was strange that of all the beautiful tourist sites in Paris, I wanted to see a graveyard first. Well, at that time in my life, I was obsessed with finding out what happens when people die, mainly because I had lost a good friend to a car accident several years earlier, and I was still pretty messed up about it. After she died, I started reading everything I could about near-death experiences and accounts of the afterlife. I also became drawn to old cemeteries, and I even conducted a seance in one. I know, not a good idea. Let me explain a little bit. Hear me out. It was a full blue moon, and it was Friday the 13th, all at the same time. So I thought, if something doesn't happen tonight, it never will. And I say seance, but I was actually by myself, so I don't know if it counts as a seance, but I hopped over the cemetery wall in my neighborhood at night, at midnight. Yeah, I made it at midnight too. And I wandered around a little bit looking for the right spot when I discovered a freshly dug grave. I got inside it, lit a candle, Ouija board, the whole thing, everything you're not supposed to do. What can I say? Such was my mania. I didn't expect to communicate with my friend, and I'd been warned by more faithful friends that I might attract malevolent spirits, but I did it anyway because if something bad happened, I would at least know that there was something beyond life and that my friend might still be alive in some way. I just wanted to scare up any kind of spook, phantom, ghost, whatever, so that I'd know this ain't it. You know, have you ever had that feeling? Like, darn it, I want proof. Yeah, I love faith, and it's a wonderful thing, but I would just like something concrete, so I went a little crazy that night. Père Lachaise Cemetery is a tourist attraction because many notable artists are buried there, including Oscar Wilde, Marcel Proust, and Frédéric Chopin. But the grave I was most interested in seeing was that of Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, because I'd been exploring his music and writing for months, actually years before this trip. Jim Morrison shared my obsession with death and the afterlife, perhaps because of a similar experience he'd had. He witnessed the aftermath of a terrible car accident as a child. His poetry and raging vocals gave a voice to the darkness in me. He wrote and sang like an animal crying out in pain. There was no self-consciousness or desire to please, just raw energy. In an era of peace and love, he crashed the party and reminded everyone that the dark side was still there. The morning of the day we went to the cemetery, Laurence and I were at a laundromat when a young Parisian man with long blonde hair and denim overalls came over, introduced himself as Henri, and handed Laurence an origami rose he had just made. He looked just like a hippie from the 1960s, and we would discover that he had the same loving nature that most of them strived for. We thanked him and complimented his artistry, and after talking for an hour or so, he wrote down his address and invited us to dinner that evening. For a few seconds, I was a little suspicious of his motives because I'd grown up in LA, a big city, and they tend to make everybody sick and suspicious. But I quickly realized, wait a minute, he didn't come all the way to Europe to be a jerk, right? So I said, we would love to. And besides, that's how things worked in the 60s. So we all parted ways, and later that day we went to the cemetery. It was very crowded, and when Laurence asked why, we learned that we had accidentally visited the cemetery on the anniversary of Jim Morrison's death, July 3rd. That was the first coincidence. I had no idea what day he died. But wait, it gets weirder. A large crowd was gathered around his grave in reverent silence. As I read his grave marker and calculated his age, I discovered the second coincidence. I was the same age then that he was when he died, 27. As I sat by his grave, I recalled the lines from his poetry that meant the most to me at that time. We must tie all these desperate impressions together. I can forgive my injuries in the name of wisdom, luxury, romance. Let me tell you about heartache and the loss of God, wandering, wandering in hopeless night. A man with dreadlocks played People Are Strange on a guitar. A young girl started to cry. Her boyfriend put his arm around her. It began to rain softly, as if her sadness was affecting heaven itself. I wondered what Jim might say if he saw us all. I imagined it might be something like, "Cheer up, man, I'm only dead." After all, he had referred to death as a beautiful friend and asked, "Can you picture what will be so limitless and free?" Unfortunately, for those who loved him, he wasn't afraid of dying. That night, we took the metro across town to Henri's apartment. His girlfriend and another couple were there. They looked like flower children, too. We all got along wonderfully. It was a warm night, so Laurence and I sat by a window. I looked out and noticed a mural of a man's face on the front wall of an apartment building across the street. I wasn't able to make out who it was at first, but as I focused, I realized it was Jim Morrison. I asked Henri why it was there. He said, "That's where he died." He pointed to a window and said, "That was his apartment, right there." That was the third and most chilling coincidence. We had not mentioned to Henri at the laundromat that we were planning to visit Jim Morrison's grave that day. In all of Paris, what were the chances of ending up a few hours later across the street from the apartment where he died? I looked at the window of Jim's old apartment again and saw the silhouette of a male figure passing behind the curtains. My rational mind knew it was just the current tenant, but my imagination had become unhinged. It was Jim, alive and well, pacing the floor, working on a new poem. I looked at the portrait on the wall again, illuminated by soft moonlight, and it seemed to be smiling playfully at my bewilderment. But that feeling turned into comfort as I imagined it was Jim's way of thanking me, not just for reading his work, but for getting to the soul of it. I like to believe that artists who have passed on know when someone is savoring their creations, and that they smile for a moment before returning to whatever they're doing in heaven. I hope so. Laurence and I said goodnight to our new friends and walked down the street toward the metro. When we reached the corner, I asked her to wait for me. I walked back to the portrait on the wall and looked up at the window of Jim's former apartment, lit with a soft yellow light. I tried to remember the William Blake line that inspired the name of Morrison's band. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. I had been living in a cavern, but for the first time in years, death didn't seem so final. Everything did seem infinite. I thought of the friend I had lost and finally felt a little peace. I closed my eyes, touched the mural of Jim's face, whispered, "Thank you," and walked away into the Paris night, into wonderful, beautiful, glorious life.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. I hope this story entertained and inspired you. If it did, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet, and sharing this story with friends and family who might enjoy it too. Thanks again for joining me on this adventure, and I hope to see you on the next one.